So this week we're going to kind of get into the politics of the temple. I know everybody hates politics. In fact, I had Carolyn told me this just before. One of the definitions of politics is poly is many and ticks is blood-sucking leeches. So politics, there you go. That's it. So many blood-sucking leeches. So that might be what we're going to look at a little bit today. Okay? We'll kind of take a peek. But we're going to talk about the priesthood and the temple aristocracy. So the aristocracy is just the hierarchy, all the different people that are kind of the prominent people. And there's not a lot of names specifically, but there's groups. And so before we can kind of get into the politics, it's kind of like having a lesson on U.S. government. Did anybody take a U.S. government class when you're in school and they walked you through, here's what the House does, and here's what the Senate does, and here's what the branches are. So we're going to kind of look at that. It's not as complicated, I would say, as what we have, but it's very similar in just a different way to how our system is set up. I think you'll see similarities as we go through some of this. So let's kind of break it down into these two main groups. Okay, so the temple aristocracy is basically divided into two groups. You had the priests, surprise, surprise, okay? And you had the Levites. Okay, so these are the people that are involved in the temple. They're the workers. They're the people conducting things. They're the ones making sure everything happens at the compound. It's a lot of people, a lot of activities, a lot of stuff happens every day, and it's broken into these two groups. Now, something to just keep in mind, priests were always Levites. Okay, I'm going to show you some verses on that in a minute, but they're always Levites. However, Levites were not always priests. So if you were a Levite and you say, I want to be a priest, you didn't just get promoted into the priesthood. I'm from this group, I get promoted. You had to be in the line of the priests.
Didn't it have to be from Aaron?
Aaron's the chief priest too, but yes, from his kids is where the priesthood came, yes. Yep, and really a direct line from Aaron is the idea of the chief priests and so on. So we'll talk about that a little bit. So here's back in Exodus. In fact, this is where it originated, Exodus 28:1. And bring near to you Aaron your brother and his sons with him from the midst of the Israelites to serve as priests for me. Aaron, Nadab, Abihu, Eleazar, Ithamar, the sons of Aaron. So this is God talking to Moses about the creation of the priesthood. This is who I want involved in this. Now there's some names here you might recognize. Eleazar, maybe you heard of him. He's probably more the one that's recognized as the faithful priest. But there's a couple other sons that Aaron had there. Nadab, Abihu, what happened to them? Do you remember? They got fried. Yeah, that's it. They did not survive. In fact, in Leviticus 10, and Aaron's sons Nadab and Abihu each took his censer. They put fire in them and placed incense on it. Then they presented before Yahweh illegitimate fire. So they did stuff out of order the way they shouldn't have, which he had not commanded them. So fire went out from before Yahweh to consume them so that they died before Yahweh. So two of the priests, Aaron's kids, didn't conduct the priesthood appropriately, and boom, they're gone. There was just no tolerance for error in this. So you can understand how the priests were pretty careful about no one gets into this court, and they had everything set because you were kind of taking your life into your hands if you were a priest. If something didn't work, they had a belief that God could just come in and you're done. Right? You're finished. Here's Numbers chapter 3. It says, Yahweh spoke to Moses, saying, bring near the tribe of Levi and set the tribe before Aaron the priest, and they will minister to him. So let's stop there. So what's the tribe of Levi? It's all these clans and these peoples. What is their primary function based on this first verse in Numbers 3? They are to basically help Aaron. Aaron's going to be in charge as the priest, and their job is to assist him. That's the job. Right? They shall observe his duties and the duties of the entire community before the tent of assembly to do the work of the tabernacle. And they will keep all the vessels of the tent of assembly and the responsibilities of the Israelites to do the work of the tabernacle. You will give the Levites to Aaron and to his descendants. They are surely assigned to him from among the Israelites. But you will count Aaron and his descendants. They will keep their priesthood, and the stranger who approaches will be put to death. So there's the establishment of, you got the priesthood, and you have the Levites. His job is to serve Aaron in the priesthood. Okay, so they're going to come from the Levites. However, they had a job which was to assist Aaron. And you can see they had to do some things like make sure the vessels were properly handled and things were cleaned up and make sure that all of the stuff was in order for the priests to conduct themselves. Okay, so they could do all of that. So for the non-priest Levites, so you're a Levite, but you're not from the priestly line. Okay, here's the kind of the stuff they had to do. So the Levites who were not priests were tasked with working the temple 2 weeks a year. So you had to sign up to work 2 weeks, and you were going to go and do your duty, and then you would have to go back home, and then what are you doing the rest of the year? You're working like everybody else. You probably got to have a job, you got to have a side gig, maybe you're a fisherman or something, but you have to know that no matter where you're at, if you're from the tribe of Levi, 2 weeks, you better be setting aside because you're going to be working in the temple, working at the temple. The rotation was 1 week every 24 weeks. There's debate on the different calendars they had. You know, we have a 52-week calendar. There's just kind of some different calendars that are debated out there on how they did that, but that's generally what they did. Now, these Levites that were not priests, you remember last week when you go in where they do the sacrifice and they had the altar and they had the rings where they put the animals' heads? There's a little wall that separated the court of Israel, okay, from that place of sacrifice. They could not go into the sacrificial area. So even though they're Levites, they are still not allowed to where the court of the priests, or where the sacrifice was happening. They had to stay out of there. Okay? This is the non-priest Levites. They handle stuff, conduct themselves, but they are not priests, so they didn't get to go into some of those areas.
Okay, who did the cleaning then?
The priests.
Oh, the priests?
Priests, yep. You couldn't even work on the altar. So if something broke, they didn't call a Levite. You had to have a trained priest in masonry to come in and fix it. No one went in there except a priest. So priests could do everything. Woodworking, they could do everything. They had a doctor, physician who was a priest. In case one of the priests needed medical attention, you couldn't just call somebody in. You had to have a priest that was trained in that.
So
All that
priests
existed.
were elitist?
They were kind of the elite class. I mean, they're part of the elite group. Yes, they're the ones. So I always think of it from think of our government. If you watch a House chamber meeting or a Senate meeting, you have all the guys sitting there with the name tags, and they're questioning the witnesses, and then there's all those people behind them that are kind of like their associates and their staff. That's kind of like the guy sitting at the thing with the nameplate. That's the priest. And the guy behind him, those are the Levites. It's the best way to think of it, is they have the people who are the official folks, the sacred position. And then you have all their people that are making sure that they can do all their stuff. They're in that service. So these Levites, the non-priest Levites, would hold positions like temple guards. They had to stand at the door, make sure people didn't cross the barriers that they shouldn't be crossing. They would be the doormen. You had to make sure the doors got open. You couldn't go in. Let's make sure these people stay out. Night watch. You had to make sure nobody snuck in, tried to get in there. They were the ones patrolling. If you got the night shift, you might be patrolling around. They were the court police. There was a problem. They were the ones that came in, the Levites, and they would have to deal with the issue, and get them out. Crowd control. When you had a huge feast or a festival, who was going to control all this massive increase of people? So they'd call in and all the Levites would be working there. Okay? They were the disciplinarians. So if someone got in trouble and they were going to receive a lashing or they were going to receive some kind of a discipline for that, it was these guys who had to carry it out. So they not only were the police, but they were kind of the judge, not the judge, but the jury and the hangman, maybe. I don't know how they say that, but
Like the people that whipped.
yeah.
They would have been Levites.
Yeah, those were Romans probably, because it was Pilate. But if there was something specifically there in the temple courts or in the complex, and they needed to get it under control, they could call these guys in because they were the Levites. They were still part of the ruling class in the temple complex, but they didn't hold the priest positions. They were kind of more of out there conducting, making sure things were done. They were actually responsible for closing the doors into the temple. It took 200 people to close it because it was such a heavy door. So every day, 200 Levites would open the doors to the temple and then they would close them. So if you were like one guy and you thought you were going to break into the temple, it's not going to happen. You'd have to get about 200 people to go and help you get the door open, and that would probably be noticed. So massive doors, 200 Levites would open it and close it every day. This group made up the singers and the musicians in the temple. So if you were a Levite, non-priest Levite, and you were part of the praise team, essentially, that was a very high honored group. They would come into the temple of the women, which was just inside, and they would sing during special festivals. They would present these different things up on the stairs right before the temple. And so to be a part of the musicians or the singers was big. That was a valued position in the court system, or in the temple court system. They were responsible for the arrest of Jesus in the garden. So when we say, okay, who went and arrested Jesus? Well, the chief priests, they went and sent the Levites, who were the guards, the temple police, and they said, go arrest him. And guess who led the charge on that? Judas. They don't know who he is. They probably heard him. Maybe some of them have seen him, but they're not sure exactly who they're getting. So what do they have Judas do? Judas goes in, and they find him in the garden, and then what does Judas do? Kisses him so that they would know who it is they're arresting. But it wasn't the Roman patrol. It wasn't the chief priests. It was the Levites' job to go and quell these type of rebels and go arrest them, and they worked on behalf of the chief priests. So it would have been the non-priest Levites who arrested Jesus in the garden. Okay? Part of that group. So there's different groups of priests. You had your regular and normal priest, and then you had your chief priests. Okay, so they were kind of broken down a little bit further. And then you even had a high priest. So you had the Levites, and then you had the priesthood. Levites, priesthood. Obviously, you can kind of see as they increase, you got your normal, regular priests, and you got your chief priests, and then you've got the high priest. So the priest's primary function, all of them, was to do this. That's it. In fact, it's not just in Judaism, it's in basically every religion out there, pagan or not. The primary function of a priest was to do sacrifices. It's the same way in Judaism. They did not go to funerals due to the possibility of defilement from a dead body. Remember, now you're a priest. You can't just be like everybody else. You get to sacred space that no one else could go into, and so you couldn't risk defilement for that. So you couldn't go to funerals, no chance that you were touching anything dead or anybody that was sick. Stay away from that stuff. They could not marry a woman that wasn't born Jewish, so if she came from another country and assimilated to Judaism, didn't matter. No foreigners, couldn't do it. So that they could marry. So just keep that in mind. They weren't totally restricted to not being married, but they could. It just had to be a pure Jewish woman. They were broken into 24 divisions per the clans of Levites. So if you go all the way back, you read Numbers. I know you fall asleep when you're reading all the different numbers there. But it breaks all these different tribes down in groups. And the Levites, the priests, were broken down by their different clans that came from Levi, right? One of the 12. There was 10,000 priests in service in the temple complex. So when we saw that huge compound last week, and this is a minimum 10,000 that were actively working in the temple complex. And you have to think about all the stuff they were doing every day. I'm going to give you a little list, but there was so much activity, it probably took 10,000 people to keep it functioning with all of the activities. Now, during major festivals, all of the priests would be called into work. So remember, there was some that they didn't have to go in all the time. They didn't need all them. So they would say, okay, we got Passover, we got the Feast of Tabernacles, we got the Pentecost. We need everybody on hand because we're going to have this giant influx. So they would bring everybody in. You got to work. It's a big holiday. We got to get everybody in here. So priests had to work in the temple 5 times a year total. So there was 2 times if there wasn't festivals. They just had to do their time. And then after that, you had to be in for the 3 festivals. So 5 times you were in there working at different lengths while you were there. The regular priests had jobs outside of the temple. So they were not all fully employed by the temple system. There just wasn't enough they needed to do. Plus, you have to remember, they had 24 divisions. You've got to somehow get all of the clans of Levi time in there. That's what they believed you had to do. So you couldn't have everybody there all the time. There wasn't that much. So they would dismiss them, and they would have to go out, and they would have to work. And then when your time came, you went and you did your service. Most of them were not wealthy. They were pretty poor. They had to go out and scrounge up a living like everybody else. In fact, here's one of the famous ones. In Luke 1, it says, it happened that in the days of Herod, king of Judea, there was a certain priest, Zechariah by name, of the division of Abijah. So there you're getting some details on his division and who he is. And he had a wife from the daughters of Aaron, and her name was Elizabeth. Who is this? John the Baptist, folks. Yeah, this is Mary's, I think, cousin. And so Zechariah was a priest. He was not a chief priest. He was not a high priest. He was a priest from the tribe of Levi, and he would have to make his round and do his time as part of that, but he didn't do it all the time. It was just one of the things he did. In fact, it goes on and says, it happened that while he was serving as priest before God in the order of his division, so it was his duty to be on for whether it was his festival or his week, according to the custom of the priesthood, he was chosen by lot to enter into the temple of the Lord to burn incense. So they had all these priests. They said, okay, who's going to do it? They would just cast lots because they had all these guys on duty. Who gets the job today? Roll the dice. If it falls on you, you get to go in and burn the incense. And so it just so happens it fell on him. And this was not just in this instance. They would constantly cast lots to see who should go in and present this or do that if there was more than one. They would say God would direct the fall of the dice or whatever it was, the lot, and that would fall on who he wanted to go. Now, when you think about Judas's, commit suicide, and they need to replace him, how do they do it? Cast lots. We'll let God decide who's going to do it. And that's, fell on Matthias. So, and the whole crowd of the people were praying outside at the hour of the incense offering, and an angel of the Lord appeared to him standing at the right side of the altar of incense. So Zechariah happens to get the lucky draw. I drew the straw this 2-week period or whatever it was. And he goes in there, and there he has this encounter with the angel. And if you remember, when he came out, because he's told his wife's going to have a baby, he can't talk because he didn't believe the angel. So the angel mutes him and says that when he came out, he was not able to speak to them. And they realized that he had seen a vision in the temple. And he kept making signs to them and remained unable to speak. And it happened that when the days of his service came to an end, he went away to his home. See, so when his time was up, he had to go back home and do work like everybody else. Unfortunately, he just couldn't talk. So what a time to serve, right? I got the straw. He's probably going home going, man, I drew the bad straw. Now I can't talk. This is just not going well. But I just wanted to show you this so you can see you get little pieces of how the priesthood worked during his division, or only during the time he served, how they would function on these things. So these are just some things the regular priests would do. Okay, the regular priests were responsible for daily sacrifices. Was there a lot of these things going on daily? Oh, yeah. You think about all the people that are coming in all the time, bringing in this, and there's a huge population, and they're bringing these animals in, and they're constantly doing this all day. This is their primary function. They had to change the showbread. So some of these guys would go in to that first room in the sanctuary, in the center part, and they would every day have to take the bread loaves, and they would take them out, and they would put fresh ones in there every day. That was their job. Burn incense. We just read that with Zechariah. They would go in, they would burn incense. It was a way, like a pleasing aroma. It was a way of appealing to God, worship. Every night, they would have to bring in more wood for for the big altar, that they were burning the sacrifices on, but they would have to restock everything. So they would go out and they would be responsible for doing that. These are the regular priests, not the Levites, remember. They're Levites, but these are priests from the tribe of Levi. They can go places the Levites can't go. So that's why they had to do some of this, which seems like, couldn't we find somebody to do that, like carry the wood in? No, they had to do it because it had to be in these specific places. So one priest would take the animal and kill it, and then they would take the blood out of it so that they could sprinkle it on the altar. It was part of that sacrifice. So they would work together, and someone would kill it, and the other would collect the blood from it, and so that they could actually conduct the sacrifice in full, not only just killing it. Then some would actually have to chop it up into the specific pieces, have barbecue, pass it out. They would do that. This would be the job to be really the bad one, right? I mean, not that sacrificing animals and collecting blood would be a lot of fun, but there was a lot of these regular priests that their job was to stand in a room outside of the court of women, which is where they had the big pillars where they would light the fires, and they would stay there. And anybody that said they had been cured of an illness, skin disease, they would have to come and show themselves to these priests who would vouch for it and sign off that they can come back into the community, back into the temple. And so they would. This is the regular priests that would do that. They had a specific place outside the court of women where you could do that. They also on Friday afternoon would have to be the ones that got the trumpet out and stood up on the top spot and blew the trumpet so people knew sunset was coming and we needed to start preparing, winding down, because as soon as it hits 6 p.m., you better be ready to be done, because that's when the Sabbath starts. No carrying this, no moving there, no going this. And so they would blow a trumpet in the afternoon just as sunset was approaching to let people know it's time just to stop. Time to stop what you're doing. So then you had the chief priests. So those were the regular priests, right? You wanted to maybe be a chief priest over a regular priest. Regular priests, you had to do all these duties. Chief priests are just one step ahead of the regular priests. And their job was to oversee, they oversaw and coordinated the lesser priests. So these are your supervisor class. This is the managers. And their job was to make sure that all of these things were done. They had to coordinate all of the schedules to make sure they had enough people here and there. So just think of management. This is management in the court, or in the temple courts. They were the powerful leaders of Israel along with the chief priest. So they weren't just another group. These were your decision makers. These are your senators and House of Representative folks. These are the ones making the decisions to lead, that affect the entire nation and the entire temple community. This is that group. And they would obviously coordinate with the chief priest, the guy who is like the executive branch, the president of the whole thing. These chief priests were actually picked by the Romans from the families with most prestige and wealth. Now we're getting into problem territory, aren't we? Why did they pick these guys? Because these were the families that had the most money and they were the most well-known, and they knew that they would have influence over the people. And so they would put them in these chief priest locations and say, you're a chief priest. Your job is to keep tabs on all this, use your influence, and work with us to accomplish the things that we want to make sure we accomplish, which is keeping things under control, not letting things get out of hand, no rebellions, no trouble. Just oversee it, make sure it all works, and work with the Romans. So the Romans picked these guys. That's one of their main tasks. So these were the ones, the chief priests were the ones who were not out there moving the wood piles and making sure the altars were stocked. They were the political masterminds and the ones who are engaged in the politics of the nation and with the Romans. They're the ones having the meetings while you're out there in the trenches as a normal priest working. These are the ones at the table having the meetings with all the upper-ups. Okay? They were responsible for stopping the rebels and troublemakers before things got out of hand. So if there was somebody causing issues, we got to deal with them so that we can stop anything, because the Romans will obviously not put up with that. If we start to show that we can't handle it, the Romans will find somebody who can. And so their job was to make sure that didn't happen. Keep things under control. They had zero tolerance for anyone who threatened their power and positions. Does this sound familiar at all? They literally would go after anyone that would potentially put their wealth, because they became very wealthy in this position, I'll show you in a second, and because they had so much power to make decisions, they had to hold on to that. And so they would crush anyone that tried to threaten that. They were not going to lose their positions of power and prestige and wealth. That was just not going to happen.
But it shouldn't have been.
Shouldn't have been. They were known for their harshness to their political enemies. If you disagreed with them or if you called them out, what would they try to do? Destroy you. This is the ruling elite class of the temple. Probably much like we would call it the deep state or the elites of our government today. You try to take away their power, what do? They come after you. Because power corrupts, and it hasn't changed no matter what age you're in. The ruling class gets power, they don't want to give it up. There's a lot of wealth that comes with it and so on. This is that group, part of the temple. These were the ones who didn't arrest, but coordinated it. So we're going to figure out what we're going to do. How are we going to arrest him? How are we going to get him? And then they sent out the peons, we'll call them, the Levites, to go out and actually conduct all the work, conduct and do the arrests. That's what they did. These priests held keys to the various doors in the temple's inner courts. In fact, they all had different keys. This is going to make sense in just a second. I'm going to make a connection you probably haven't seen before. There's a verse in Hebrews that talks about Jesus. It says, therefore, because we have a great high priest who has gone through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold fast to our confession. Author of Hebrews makes the case that Jesus is actually our high priest. He's a priest. In fact, he even goes on to say he's a priest in the order of Melchizedek, but he puts him as a priest, a very special priest. Okay, I want you to keep that in mind. One of the things the priests had to do was carry the keys to the temple. Look at this in Revelation 1:17. He says, do not be afraid. I am the first and the last. This is Jesus talking. And the one who lives, and I was dead, and behold, I am living forever and ever, and I hold the keys of death and Hades. Now that we think of that very symbolically. Got it. You know, he's the controller of heaven or death and life, basically. But from a priest standpoint, this would mean something very significant because the priests were the one who held the keys to the different places you could go in the temple. And here you have a priest, Jesus, and he has keys to places greater than the temple. And he deserves all the keys. He says this is what the Holy One, the true one, the one who has the key of David, the one who opens and no one can shut, and who shuts and no one can open, says. So this would have struck a chord with anybody who was familiar with the priesthood, because you're going, the chief priests are the ones who held the keys. And here Jesus is saying what? I have all the keys. I'm the one who holds the key. I'm the correct priest. And I have access to everything. It's all under my authority. There were 7 keys that the chief priests held. They actually had, everybody held a different one. So they had 7 specific priests that held these different keys. And so they would have to come in and open this door to go into this place. So every day they would come in and they would have to open up the courts. And so they didn't give all the keys to everyone. In fact, you had to have a complete number of priests in order to get the complete temple open. And how many was it? 7, which is the number of completeness in the Bible. The temple could not be completely opened until all the chief priests were assembled to open the court doors. You had to have all 7. Hopefully somebody didn't call in sick that day, right? I guess we're not having temple. No, they'd have to get the key and have somebody else come. Now look at this. This is from Revelation 1. It says, I turned to see the voice which was speaking with me. When I turned, I saw 7 golden lampstands. So you have Jesus, the priest, with the keys. And where is he at in this vision? He's standing amongst the 7 lampstands, which we know are the churches. He's the high priest. This is more priestly language. It's reflective of that. And it says, this is what the one who holds the 7 stars in his right hand says, the one who walks in the midst of the 7 golden lampstands. There's kind of a cross there. It's interesting how you have the 7 priests that have the 7 keys to open the temple courts. And then you have this language going to Jesus about he's the key holder. And where does he reside? Amongst the 7 golden lampstands. And he has the churches. It's like a different priesthood, isn't it? It's a little bit different. So the chief priests oversaw and managed all of the money coming into the temple. Uh-oh, this is where things go south. They were the budget guys, right? They were the supervisors to all activities conducted at the temple, including giving, sacrifices, you name it. They had to make sure that it was done properly. They were made up of the controlling body called the Sanhedrin. You've probably heard of the Sanhedrin. This involved the chief priests. The Sanhedrin not only had the chief priests, but it also had what they call the elders, which these are just the most wealthy, prominent people in Israel, in Jerusalem. So it's like that family name, Rockefeller, you think of, whatever the name was, they would, even now today, it's interesting because when the president or somebody wants to have a finance discussion over economy, sometimes they'll call in people like Warren Buffett. He's not a elected official, but he is a prominent, wealthy individual who has success, and so they'll call him in and say, what do you think we ought to do? That's similar to what these guys would do. They had their chief priests, like their legislators and all their officials, and then they would say, to make up a complete group, we'll go get the most wealthy, prominent people that are not priests, and we'll also include them in this kind of decision-making body we'll call the Sanhedrin. Chief priests, elders, and they'll get together and make decisions on different things. So they would call this group. So when you read in your Bible the chief priests and the elders, that's what it means. The chief priests are literally the temple employee management group, and the elders are the prominent wealthy people from Israel who worked to make sure that they kept peace, made decisions. They were the elites. The elders were people of influence who offered advice to the leaders. We talked about that. Here's one of them. This wasn't a bad one. This was a good one. But he was an elder. He was on the Sanhedrin, and he was a wealthy guy. Not a Levite, not a priest. But yet he was involved in the decision-making because of his clout, because of his name.
Okay, Joseph.
Joseph of Arimathea. Do you remember him?
Who is he?
So here he is. He's the guy that took Jesus' body down and asked for it to be taken down. So here's Mark 15. Joseph of Arimathea, a prominent member of the council. So he was not a priest. He was just a member of the Sanhedrin, who was also himself looking forward to the kingdom of God, came acting courageously and went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. So he was one of the Sanhedrin, but clearly not on board with everything that was going on. Remember, he's just one guy of this ruling, prominent body of chief priests and other elders and leaders. So in the years before Jesus, Josephus writes a lot of this. He has a number of volumes called the Antiquities of the Jews, and he basically records all of the history and different things going on, and he describes the way things. So a lot of this comes out of his stuff. But in the years before Jesus, there was a divide that was growing between the chief priests and the regular priests. You had the guys serving in the trenches, and you had the managers, and there was this divide that was growing between them. The chief priests had grown corrupt, and it was known by all of the regular priests and everybody else that they weren't conducting themselves in an upstanding manner. They were known to enrich themselves by their power and position. Surprise, surprise. You give people a bunch of power, especially in a theocracy like this, where now they have religious power, they have political power, national power, and they all of a sudden say, you know what, I think there might be something in this for me. It's not about service anymore, it's about self. It was recorded that they would send mobs to regular priests and take tithes given as well as their valuables earned during their temple service. So if you were like a priest who was working and someone gave you an offering or gave you a gift, the chief priest would come in and be like, where's mine at? Where's my cut of that? And they would go after the regular priests. In fact, some of them were beaten. And they were just robbed. They would send out this mob of hitmen to go to the regular priests and take their stuff if they wouldn't hand it over, or beat them up and take it and bring it back for them because they think they were entitled to it. And so the chief priests and the regular priests, all of a sudden this gap began to grow where they did not get along. They were not on the same page. It's recorded that some priests actually starved because the chief priests took all they had by force. That sounds pretty rough, doesn't it? They didn't care about anybody below them. They only cared about their power and their wealth and their prestige. They grew wealthy. The chief priests grew wealthy in this place because they could just take. And people were bringing tithes, and guess what that did? That gave them money because they worked at the temple and they stayed at the temple, and that's how they made their income. So let's talk about this setting real quick. We'll be right back to that. All the sacrifices that were brought in before the priest, it had to be perfect, remember? That was the requirement. A spotless lamb cannot have a blemish on it. Came in. Now, if you're a chief priest and you're corrupt, you're going, I wonder if we could use this to enrich ourselves. So they had an area set up in what they called the royal stoa for people to purchase items and animals so that they could be, if you came in and you realized, I forgot something or my animal wasn't good enough, guess what? We have them available. It wasn't a bad thing initially In fact, Jesus actually didn't say that in itself was wrong. It was what they were doing with it that went bad. That was a thing to really serve people who came and they were there. Maybe they made a huge pilgrimage and they were staying there and they were there for only a amount of time. And they were like, uh-oh, I've left something back at home. I can't just go back and get it. They would say, well, you can just get it here. And so they had an area where you could make these purchases of animals and different things. Now, some think that when Caiaphas, who was the high priest at the time of Jesus, that he goes, you know what, this is awesome. We could turn this into a giant moneymaker. And that he took it from just the little bit in the Stoa and he expanded it out into the court of Gentiles. So it was just this massive marketplace. The high and chief priests got a portion of everything sold at the temple. So what was that, like their tax almost? So the more that's sold, what does that mean if you're a chief priest? Or the richer you get. So you see the benefit where they're going, maybe we should bring a few more vendors in, maybe. Now they were the ruling party, and so anybody that set up a spot there to sell in the temple had to be approved by the chief priests and the high priest. You had to be approved. Now you have, hey, my buddy over here gives me some kickback. Let's give him a spot up front. And this is the kind of stuff that was going on in the temple courts. It wasn't like you came in and put your name on the ledger because you wanted to sell lambs for people. It was, now it's a buddy system. I've got my people here that I'm going to pick and put in places so that they'll give me a cut of what they get, and I'll give them better positions to sell stuff because they'll give me more. And the corruption of the chief priest led this to go on. Because they approved it all. They had to approve all this. And they got a cut of everything that was sold. So you can imagine if somebody comes in and says, give me a spot and I'll give you 25% instead of the 20% that everybody else, you're going to get a spot probably up front. This is the kind of stuff that was going on in the temple complex under the corruption of the chief priests. Sounds like the government, doesn't it, a little bit? I kind of was thinking the lobbyists, if you go and you lobby your chief priest, your business is going to get, lobby your congressman, maybe you're going to get this thing over here. They had that going on, except it was just, I want to sell my goats or my sheep. Can I get a spot? I said, well, yeah, just a little kickback and I'll give you a great spot. Perfect. People coming from all over the world brought with them different currencies. Remember, it's not just this currency or Roman currency. I mean, they're coming making pilgrimages, and these are people that are scattered all over. They're still scattered. They're not all in Israel yet. And so the market right there allowed for the exchange of currencies. So the temple tax and anything the temple took in had to be paid in tier silver. That was the standard at the temple. That's the only silver they took. Why? It was 94% silver. If you wanted Roman silver, it was only 84%. We don't take that. So you had to have an exchange going on where you could bring your Roman silver or your other coinage and you could swap it out at the temple and get this particular type of silver. In fact, when tier silver stopped being made in tier, the temple started making their own tier silver because it was the standard. They started making their own currency because that was it. Had to be this way or we're not taking it. So when you think Judas, 30 pieces of silver, it was 94% silver. It was tier or tire silver that he had. That was the requirement. Silver shekels were the currency of the temple. So they'd say, a shekel's this kind of weight and these different things. That's what they call it, silver shekels. But it's specifically this silver from Tyre. That has to be the stuff. So during Passover and other feasts, the market would be expanded from the Stoa into the court of Gentiles. And when Jesus comes in right before the crucifixion, what's happening? What's the festival that's going on? What's taking place? Passover. It's massive. You've got this massive influx of people. So the market not only stayed in the Stoa, but probably had been given authorization to, let's expand it. We got a big crowd coming in. And it was all the way into the court of Gentiles, which is the largest area of the compound. Then something happens. And this is where things start to go off the rails. And Jesus entered the temple courts, and he drove out all those who were selling and buying in the temple, and he overturned the tables of the money changers and the chairs of those who were selling doves. And he said to them, "It is written, my house will be called a house of prayer, but you have made it a cave of robbers." So it's Passover. He's done his triumphal entry, and he goes into the temple courts, and he's there where this would normally be going, and he's realized something has gone wrong here, and he just doesn't flip out. He just says, it's time to clean this up. I'm going to clean this up. Now think about it from a political standpoint. What's been going on in the priesthood before Jesus does this? For years, what's been going on? Corruption, enrichment, giving your buddies the prominent spot. It's just a good old boys elite moneymaker for the temple chief priest and the high priest. And then here comes this guy in. And he says, this should not be going on. How are they going to respond? Oh, okay. They push back, don't they? This is not acceptable. Who does this guy think he is? Here's a question. Why was Jesus so mad? When he goes in and he looks at his house, he looks at his establishment, the thing that is his, and he sees it being run this way, he just says, this is unacceptable. Not acceptable. Now, there's a few reasons people think that he was this mad. Could be a combination, could be all three. Dishonest scales. They had to weigh these things. How much in this particular type of silver, 94%, what was the weight compared to this? And they think maybe there was, the corruption had got to the point where the people there had said, we can kind of finagle the system and make it work. Temple dishonoring. Well, obviously this is a big one. What's supposed to be going on here? Service, prayer, coming to God, not money making and lobbying and all this other stuff. Not acceptable. Robbery. Obviously he didn't like that because he called them a bunch of robbers. People are coming in here and they're giving to you and they're trying to do what's right and you're taking it for your own enrichment. Sounds like kind of familiar, doesn't it, a little bit? Luke 19 says this, "It was written, in my house will be a house of prayer, but you have made it a cave of robbers." A robber is anyone who takes another's money items by force. That's the Greek word used. It literally means someone taking something by force from someone else. It says, was Jesus speaking of more than just the money changers in the temple complex? He goes in, he flips the tables, and he says this. Is he just talking about the vendors?
No, he's talking about the priests.
He's talking about the chief priests. And he's not only targeting them because of what they've done to the people, but also what they've done to the lesser priests. What kind of impact would this action have on the chief priests? Who are you to call us out for what we've been doing for years? Who are you to come in and try to clean this stuff up? Who are you to try to flip the economy and the income of how we've done this in the temple? Who do you think you are? You're going against the establishment. That's what was happening. So they didn't take it laying down, did they? So a man pushing back against the rule, the money, the power of the establishment had to be dealt with. We've got to get this guy out of here because he threatens everything we've been doing to enrich ourselves for so long. No wonder he was in the crosshairs, right? Josephus, who was that Jewish priest, he recorded the depth of the corruption in the temple leadership. The chief and high priests would give favored people market slots to sell items. He just highlights how bad it was, how corrupt it was in the marketplace at the time of Jesus. Just terrible corruption. They would get the kickbacks, we talked about that, from individuals, and they obviously approved all temple sales and got a portion of the money. So, again, they're in total control, and they're just enriching themselves like crazy. So the Jews answered and said to him, "What sign do you show to us because you are doing these things?" So he flips the tables, he gets everybody out of there. The first thing they say is, "What sign?" And so what do they mean by this? Who authorized you to do this? Remember, who's Jesus in their eyes? He's just a self-proclaimed teacher. He's never been through our classes. He's never been through our school. He is not part of the establishment. He did not go through politics 101 of the temple courts. He's just a guy who took care of his parents in carpentry after his dad probably died. And then all of a sudden he's become this prominent teacher who's got a following. And he's coming in here trying to flip the system upside down. We're not going to take well to this. Who does he think he is? And so they say, basically, show us who authorized you. What's the sign? Where's your letter of, who told you to do this? So Jesus looked right into their hearts, and here's what he says. Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I'll raise it up. What is he saying? So he didn't have to go through all this question and answer. He's looking right at him going, I know exactly what you're going to do. Because the only way you deal with this is you kill me. That's it. Because I'm standing in the way, and I know what people are capable of. I know what's in their hearts, especially people with power and wealth and prestige, and they are set on it. And so he looks right at him. He doesn't say, you guys just need to quit taking advantage of people. What does he say? Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I'll raise it up. Because he knows they're looking at him going, we have to take this guy out. He says, you take it out, I'll just pick it right back up. Cuts right to the chase. So Jesus knew that impacting the money of the chief priests and the high priest would lead to his crucifixion. He knew it. When you go after the establishment and you try to take away their power and their wealth and their money-making machine in corruption, they will do everything to defend themselves, including go after and kill the person who's threatening it. 100%. Not much has changed, has it? When someone goes after the corrupt establishment pocketbook, they go after him. So why is it this event at the temple with the court flipping the tables and driving out the money changers? Why was that right before the crucifixion? I mean, you're right on the cusp of it. Now he's hitting them right in the pocketbook. And he has a big following. I mean, Jesus is appealed to the common man, the everyday guy. Probably a lot of the regular priests. And they're going, he's right. The corruption is terrible. He's right. And now he's got a bunch of followers that you can't get rid of every one of them. You have to cut the head off, is what the idea of the chief priest is. How do you kill him? You got to cut the snake's head off, and then the rest of it will die. All the followers will go back to following us once he's gone. It was the chief priests who ultimately called for the arrest, and they ultimately killed Jesus. It was the chief priests. Probably not the regular priests, not the Levites. It was the political managers of the temple complex. The chief priests and the high priest together. We got to get rid of this guy. He's a political problem for us. So the next day, after Jesus flips these tables and does all this, this is the next day. And after he arrived at the temple, the chief priests and the elders of the people came up to him while he was teaching, saying, by what authority are you doing these things, and who gave you this authority? And Jesus answered and said to them, I also will ask you one question. If you tell the answer to me, I also will tell you by what authority I'm doing these things. For where was the baptism of John, from heaven or from men? It's not over yet. There's a big problem brewing here. And you've got the elites now coming out saying, who gave you the authority? Who said you can do these things? And even after the day was over, they came back the next day and said, we got to have a conversation. This is a very involved conversation between the rebel in their mind, who's questioning them, and the establishment. And he says, okay, here's my question. From what was the baptism of John? From heaven or from men? And they began to discuss this among themselves, saying, if we say from heaven, he will say to us, then why then did you not believe? Because they didn't like John the Baptist. They didn't like him. But if we say from men, we're afraid of the crowd because they all look at John as a prophet. And they answered and said to Jesus, we do not know. And he said to them, neither will I tell you by what authority I am doing these things. He was no dummy. I mean, this guy was sharp. He could come in and he could just say, well, let's just get to the heart of the issue. Is it by God I did these things, or is it by man? So let's just use another example. And they couldn't answer, could they? Because on one hand, they hated John, but on the other hand, the crowd, the people knew that John was a prophet. They held that he was a prophet. So when Jesus comes in and flips tables, you have to make a decision now, right? Is this God's will? Maybe this is the God finally getting rid of the corruption we all know has been going on in the courts for a long time. And if they come in and say, okay, this whole thing with John, and they ended up admitting that, yeah, Jesus was from God, then they would have to clean up the temple courts, wouldn't they? And if they said he's not, now they've got a mob. They're stuck. So you notice Jesus had the people. We always think of the mob calling and being like, crucify him. We'll get to that later. That was not the majority of the people. That was a plant. That was a setup. We're going to talk about that later. The regular people liked what Jesus was doing. They liked him. He made it real for the average guy. The sinner could come and actually be welcomed by God. Like, it was totally different. So after Jesus refused to answer the question, it's not over. The conversation doesn't end and go on to another day. He keeps going. And he says, by the way, I want to tell you a story. And he gives the parable of the two sons. Then he goes on and says, by the way, I got another parable for you of the wicked tenants. And then he says, by the way, I'm the cornerstone of this whole complex. And you'll either be crushed by it or you'll trip over it and you'll fall to pieces. But either way, I'm the one. Now it's interesting because he's doing all this while he's standing at the temple. He's got all these chief priests, these people. He's in the courts of the temple when he's telling them this stuff. He's right there. Now, we'll go through this a little bit because we're going to run out of time. But you remember the parable of the two sons? The one son, he says, I want you to go to work in the vineyard. And he says, I'm not going. And then he decides later on, you know what? I am going to go to work in the vineyard for my dad. But then there's also the other son who says, I want you to go to work in my vineyard. And he says, okay, I'll go. And then he doesn't do anything. Who's he talking about in the context of what we just went through? Who's standing in the crowd there that's saying, whose authority do you do these things? The chief priests. That's who this is directed at. He's literally saying, by the way, chief priests, I got a little story for you. See if you can make sense of this. Who are they in the illustration? The ones who said, yeah, we'll go to work, and then they didn't do it. Who are the ones who didn't go to work and then later decided they want to? The sinners, the prostitutes, the tax collectors, the people he's been out saying, you've been running from God. How about you come to him? And they go, yeah, we want to. Can we have forgiveness? The people, the establishment. The people, the establishment. Then he talks about the vineyard manager, the tenants, the wicked tenants. Remember, he puts the guys in charge of the vineyard. He says, you guys need to take care of it. And then he goes away and says, by the way, I want you to just send me the fruit, the produce off my vineyard. And then what do? When he sends the messengers in to collect, what do they do to the messengers? They kill them. And so at one point he says, okay, so he sent his own son saying they'll respect my son. But when the tenant farmers saw the son, they said among themselves, this is the heir, let's kill him and have the inheritance. He's talking to the chief priest standing at the temple, and he's describing them. Describing them. And it says, now he even asks them here, now when the master of the vineyard arrives, what will he do to these tenant farmers? And they said to him, he will destroy those evil men completely and lease the vineyard to the other tenant farmers who will give him the fruits in their season. Guess who the new tenant farmers are? Jesus said to them, have you never read the scriptures? The stone which the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. This came about from the Lord and it is marvelous in our eyes. For this reason, I tell you that the kingdom of God will be taken away from you and be given to a people who produce its fruits. And the one who falls on this stone will be broken to pieces, and the one on whom it falls, it will crush him. So he's basically telling the chief priests, I'm taking you out of power. And I'm the one who can do it. Because you did not take care of my house like you should have. Right after he flipped the tables, I went, Notice what they say, when the chief priests and the Pharisees heard his parables, they knew he was speaking about them. And although they wanted to arrest him, they were afraid of the crowds because they looked upon him as a prophet. So, things have gotten very heated. Because not only does he go into these places and he's not part of this typical class with the proper education, but he goes in there and he just cuts right to the core. And everybody standing around, including some of the priests, know he's exactly right. These corrupt guys have not been doing what they should have been doing. And he's the one representing them and standing between them and the establishment.